Welcome everybody to the Great Books mini lecture for March. Before we start, I always want to thank marketing and the CoLab, our video production staff. They help make this possible every year, and we're off to a great start already with the fall semester, and looking forward to today's presentation and one more to go in April. My name is Michael Carragher. I'm Associate Professor of English, and along with Maureen Fitzpatrick, we sort of put these things together. And it's always a pleasure to kind of reach out to members of the JCCC community and ask them to talk about a book that means something to them. And today, we have Uros Petrovic, been at JCCC since August of 2009, serves on various committees, initiatives from Ed Affairs, Inclusion and Belonging, Educational Technology, Advisory Council. He's taught many courses in social sciences and social and cultural theories at various institutions. Here at JCCC, he's taught classes Introduction to Sociology, Social Problems, Theories of Inequalities and Diversity. His educational background is interdisciplinary, to say the least. Before moving to the U.S. and while living in his native former Yugoslavia, he studied philosophy, sociology, and I'll kind of go specific here, mostly sociology of knowledge, research methodology, and social and cultural theory and social philosophy. He also studied comparative literature, and he says, finally, also law, of which he jokes, one must eat after all. When he moved to the United States in the 1990s, his formal graduate studies at North Dakota State University, Graduate Theological Foundation, and the University of Kansas focused exclusively on the study of sociology. His research and scholarly interests, again, are sociology of knowledge and sociology of indigenous knowledges, social and cultural theory, studies of globalization and nationalism, studies of bureaucracy and organizational development, sociology of inequalities, public sociology, sociology of law, sociology of philosophy, art, and language. As you can see, very diverse, interdisciplinary. He is currently developing a program in public sociology here at the college. He has worked as an organizational developer over the last 20 plus years for various companies and organizations, and in the last 15 years, he's been learning from and working with many indigenous communities throughout the United States. He considers Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota his second home and one of the most beautiful places on earth. In addition to JCCC, Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence has a special place in his heart. He taught many classes there for almost 15 years. He worked for various indigenous communities, mostly coastal, and on the main island in Hawaii, on organization development, adaptation to often devastating effects of climate change on indigenous communities throughout the U.S. And in those capacities, he worked with a number of government organizations, including National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, National Center for Atmospheric Research, on various projects and trainings. His particular emphasis in research is sociology of indigenous knowledge and co-creation of scientific knowledge between indigenous and non-indigenous knowledges as forms and content for adoption to the climate change effects on those coastal communities. If that's not enough, at home, Uros does nothing but grade students' papers. I hear you. Reads, he writes, he walks his German Shepherd. Occasionally he watches Curb Your Enthusiasm, Monty Python, films by Fellini, Tarkovsky, Godard, and a few others. Except to love his wife and children, who I am lucky enough to know, learning from his students and colleagues, there is nothing more he likes to do. Today's book is by Ivo Andrić, and it is an abbreviated version of a larger opus of the work and a convenient choice to introduce this complex writer and thinker to an English-speaking audience. Uros is here today to tell us why we should know Andrić and this work. Friends, Uros Petrovic.
Thank you, everyone. I promised that I will try to stay in this box here. I was told not to be in this area, although by nature I keep walking more than I probably should. Thank you so much Michael. It's such a pleasure, it's such an honor to be here. I watched some of the previous speakers, and there's absolutely no way that I can even come close to their level of eloquence and specificities. But I'll do my best to address this rather mysterious author on many levels. As Michael pointed out, Andrić was a person who was a really complex thinker. And he was born in what was then Austro-Hungary at the end of 19th century and died in 1975 in Belgrade, which is now capital of Serbia and at that time capital of former Yugoslavia, a country that I consider to be my native country. In the 90s, there were a number of wars going on, and the country broke into several different countries, from Slovenia, the closest, to Austria, to I want to make sure I pronounce this correctly, the Northern Republic of Macedonia, in case there are some Greeks here. I don't want to say just Macedonia, right? Which is the closest to Greece. He died in 1975, beloved, admired by all Yugoslav at the time. Later on, just before the war started in the 1990s, as with any big public intellectual in Europe and parts of Latin America, he becomes rather controversial because in one of his books, specifically the one that he won the Nobel Prize for, The Bridge over Drina, some public intellectuals, based on their ethnic identities, start either celebrating him or demonizing him one way or the other. We don't have time, nor do I have inclination, to be quite frank with you, to go into those controversies. But hence, the word convenient. This book that we're looking through is rather short, and it's a collage of three much larger books. Each is this thick. This is the original version, that were chosen by some of the best Slavists, including one person, Professor Alexander, who retired recently at Berkeley, which I am honored to know her and consider one of the best Slavists that there ever has been. She contributed in translating and creating some aspects of this book. So, why Ivo Andrić? Because I think that he has something that he can tell us and can teach us. Why conversation with Goya, bridges, and signs? So three elements. Because it's convenient. Because as a very young person, I fell in love in all of those three books, and quite often would come back to them to this very day. Although I'm trying to be emotionally aware each time I read him or reread him, because as I age, my emotional responses are becoming more and more intense. I was sharing with Michael before, I'll try not to become too emotional as I read some of his work. There are three elements that we will address. The first one I pretentiously call Andrić's theory of art. That is this notion of conversation with Goya. Goya was a Spanish painter, a famous Spanish painter from the 18th and 19th century. He died in 1828. And he is known as the last of the traditional ones and the first of the modern ones. He's often referred to in theories of art as really the founding father of Romanticism, although we will see through some of his work that his expressions of Romanticism were quite different from what we get to know as Romanticism later on, at least within the continental theories of art, European theories of art. Bridges are a recurring theme in Andrić's work. And bridges have become, given that the topic of these series is why a particular book means something to us, they've become a recurring theme for myself. I don't go to a place let me put it this way. If I go to a place, I always look for bridges first. I'm drawn to bridges and their cultural and historical significance. And then reflections or signs. This is the book on reflections. It's a huge one. It's a combination, I would argue, of meditations, if you will, on one hand in a philosophical sense, and on the other hand, the early existentialist work that Kierkegaard, for example, had, or we can find in early Greek literature and Western literature, almost Homeric type of, from the Iliad type of the meditations that one finds. Okay, the very first thing that I want to talk about here, so the first part is conversation with Goya. And one of the things that he does is creates this fictional, Andrić does, creates this fictional conversation in the city of Bordeaux in France, where actually Goya moves from 1824 to 1828 when he dies. Goya was originally from Spain and really suffered dramatically. He lost, he became deaf at age of 46. And we'll see later on why Andrić, I would argue, develops this affinity with Goya to the point that he dedicates the entire form in which he talks about art, theorizes about art, which is very much unlike Andrić. It gives him a platform through which he can talk about art in a way that he was never able to talk in his own writing, and almost frees him to that point. And interestingly enough, Andrić does spend some time in Bordeaux in France as well, not necessarily in exile, but in voluntary exile, where he spends the last couple of years of his life visiting places that Goya was. Hence the notion of Goya in Andrić's work, right? What I did for the pure sense of practicality was to divide Andrić's pretentiously called theories of art into 10 parts, right? So we can digest them a little bit easier. It is Goya who is speaking, and Andrić is fictionally next to him and listening while they're sitting in a cafe. One thing that absolutely amazes me is the beginning of the work when Andrić actually talks about the instrument of art, if you will. I shall go that far to say an instrument of creation. And Goya is a painter, a rather intense painter, to say the least, on many levels. Given that I'm presenting here for, I suppose, mostly American audience, I'm not going to go into slightly more problematic aspects of Goya's obsessions. But suffice to say that his notion of art is deeply existentialist, right? It is almost as if one is reading Sartre and nausea, in a sense of it is arm that hurts. So Andrić says, and I will be doing this throughout presentation, referring, one of my goals, by the way, is for you to feel once, hopefully, you will leave the room, but hopefully when you leave the room, that you've read this piece, if I may say that. So he says, Andrić says of Goya, I thought I had that marked. Yes, it's right here. As he spoke, and please look at that arm over there as we talk about that, I looked down at the table on which his right hand was laying, like something separate, living a life on its own. A terrible hand, like some magic root amulet, knotted, gray, strong, but dry as a desert hillock. It was alive, but with the invisible life of rock. It had neither blood nor sap, but was made of some other material of which the qualities are unknown to us. It was not a hand for shaking or caressing, for taking or giving. Gazing at it, I wondered in alarm how a human hand could grow like that. So the notion of Goya, and I won't be able to go into Goya's art necessarily too much, is this complete immersion with the art, right? So it starts with a tool, if you will. And Andrić, for all of his poeticism, is a deep believer in order. And we can have a whole discussion. Why is he a deep believer in order? Is he hiding something by imposing order on the world that is inherently in disharmony with itself? The very first notion, and I'm drawing this, you will have, you can see different interpretations. These are my interpretations of his theory of art, or at least meditations upon art, right? The first notion that Andrić postulates is that an artist, and just to make sure, in the United States, sometimes that might not be evident. When European authors talk about art, they deeply include writing into the art form, as well as other forms of art, and I'll talk about that. But be that as it may, artist is always suspicious character. The original language is suspicious face. I like it, but it's not easily translatable in English. But I like in German, for example, or in Serbo-Croatian, this notion of a face, right? It has the theatrical moment attached to it, almost from Shakespearean time. It's a masked person in a dusk. It is a traveler, and I love this part, with a false passport. There might be a decent person beneath, but for Andrić, artist, and he's touching upon not necessarily just the national politics of his country, but the national politics throughout ages, the artist is always a suspect, someone who brings dangerous ideas, someone who questions things, and therefore it is a suspicious face, suspicious character that always has to be guarded. Throughout literature, we can find characters that are welcomed to towns and cities just to be expelled from the towns and cities, or worse yet, guillotined in those towns and cities because they were pronounced to be suspicious characters. Andrić is saying it comes with the territory. If you want to be artists, you have what I like to call not inherent rights, but inherent responsibilities to engage in the work that nobody else wants to engage. So the first notion of Andrić is rather revolutionary, if you will, although we will see he tends to be a diplomat, pun not intended actually here, because he was a diplomat. He was an ambassador in Germany when the World War II started, of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, or the first Yugoslavia. The second notion of that I at least perceive as an important contribution of his to the understanding of art is what is artist's vocation, how it's being delineated, if you will. First, it is transformation from nothing into something. He has the idea that artist actually points into an empty space and creates something. We will come back to this leitmotif of creation, but I will argue that, well, we'll get to that point, that there's creation and anti-creation, which are equally dialectical connected with each other. Also, and by the way, these paintings that you're seeing in the background are Goya's paintings, so that's what I meant by his forms of romanticism are quite different than their offsprings later on. Capturing of the moment is absolutely essential for the artist because of the ephemeral nature of everything that they touch. So to be artist means to deal with something which is profoundly uncertain. And we're going to come back to that leitmotif again later on. The third aspect is what kind of world does artists create? It's one of my favorite theorizing on his part, if you will, or meditating on his part. Yes, it creates a new one. We're coming back to the previous slide. It points into an empty space. But at the same time, it's not the same world as the world in which we live. It's a similar to it, and it's not identical. This notion was captured very specifically by many European social theories. For example, everyone from structuralist and post-structuralist in the 60s to Frankfurt School. Adorno, for example, referenced Andrić in terms of the ideas that there is something on the other side. There is a possibility. There is an action implied to that. Andrić says that when artist creates an action. It is an activity, as we will see. I know it sounds self-evident and self-explanatory, but I think that that needs to be often emphasized, that it's really an activity, not just an activity of writing or painting, but activity of an intent, an activity of the movement towards something else, right? So this, I don't want to call it dichotomy, but this plurality of the worlds in which art is one part, so similar, so connected, yet slightly different. There is an autonomy to it, to the real world, is essential in Andrić's work. And I think that throughout his entire opus, there's that struggle, I'll talk a little bit about that, that tension between Andrić, the person of the people, and Andrić, the author and the artist who wants to be left alone. That is not necessarily his own, but it's characteristic of many intellectuals, particularly public intellectuals, who are struggling with that notion where the emphasis should be put. What is an ontological reality of artists, right? At that very core, what constitutes it? What is the essence, if we can use that word? Well, Andrić is very specific here. Andrić is not postmodernist. Andrić cannot stand postmodernism in any shape or form, right? So he does believe in a single reality. But that single reality that art creates is always manifested differently. And if we were to dive into the reasons why he believes so, one of them is, of course, socially constructed. Where he was born, the multi-ethnic, the multi-religious, the multi-everything space of the Balkans, and this deep desire for something to work, to bring these people, which if I shamelessly can plug in, part of my dissertation when I dedicated it, I said, may they finally see themselves in themselves. Because fundamentally you're talking about very similar people, if not identical people, whose few religions somehow divided them, and the history is imposing all these social structures on them. So he deeply yearns for this sense of, shall I put it in a form that is closer to us, of some kind of Americanism in a South Slavic sense that brings people together, yet protects all those beauties of diversity that people bring, but at the same time provides at least few lines that are coming to us as human beings. And I think that he's almost imposing that as an ontological reality to the artist itself. This is your job, although he's the last one to say that openly. But he is provoking intellectually people to potentially think about that. One of my favorite, artist is a demigod. The power of creation, and what I was referring to earlier, anti-creation. And I want to read you one part here, and I gave a little bit of it to you when he talks about what artist does. In my house, Besides my mother lived little Rosarita. At this name, the old man lowered his sharp gaze at something like a mist passed over his closed eyes. One day, when she was 5 years old, I heard a conversation between her and a little boy who had just started school and was showing off his knowledge in front of the little girl. Here's the beautiful part. "And do you know who made people?" asked the boy. "People? I know. Uncle Francisco," replied a little girl, pointing to the portraits standing around my studio. The boy, who wanted to show off, stammered as though he had forgotten, said, "God? God made them?" But his eyes remained transfixed by the paintings around him and the little girl showing him one human figure after another, pronounced triumphantly in front of each of them, "Uncle Francisco made them. Uncle Francisco made them." This notion of creation is absolutely astonishing in Andrić's work. But by creating, there is a parallel universe in which decreation takes place. It's a blasphemy that occurs simultaneously, in which one is challenging that, right? There is a notion of, almost Nietzschean notion of God is that idea, and it's up to artists to create and recreate, construct and deconstruct the world in which we live. And Andrić deeply believes in this power of artistic expression, if you will. Artists and its autonomy. This is a rather complex idea within his work. And I was talking with two friends of mine, one who currently teaches at University of Oxford, who is from Sarajevo, and another who is at University of Belgrade, and they slightly disagree with me on my take on this part about Andrić and artists and the autonomy. I don't use these two terms to gobbledygook, whatever the Dutch word is. Why don't I use push and pull instead? Centrifugal and centripetal. But I think that these two words really capture the notion, the tension that Andrić is pushing and putting before us. At the same time, artist wants to center things, wants to follow the path. Goya follows the path. But at the same time, as he's creating the modern age, the old age, quote unquote, is always with him. Transitions never end, right? But on the other hand, there is a harder part to move away from the gravity, to move away from the pool, to create its own circle of influence, both within artistic communities and artists as a social representative, almost as you will. So the notion of artist and autonomy is constantly in flux. And that's why I like this Goya's painting or picture where, you know, there are two different species coming together and trying to pull each other out. The one who sleeps and is about to die, and a donkey who is trying to understand the world around it. Okay. There are artists and there are artists. Yet another of my favorite notions. Goya really, this is, I believe, one of the most sophisticated part of the conversation with Goya. The one that almost haunted me since high school days. By the way, just for the record, both Andrić and I went to the same high school, so we would all, many different, it's called First Gymnasium. And this quote actually is enshrined in one of our high school classes. And I pondered as a kid almost about why, what's so powerful about that, at least to me. There are different forms of artists. And he's saying in this book of those who paint, that there is a specific level of suffering that painters endure that is different from any other artist. I'm left here condemned and shackled, a witness of whom only the name is known. Maybe not even that. I'm left forever nothing but a picture, and not a picture of myself, but a picture of one of your glances. Goya was mostly painting portraits. And Andrić looks at portraits and sees them not necessarily as lonely, but as isolated, as both deeply humane but also anti-humane, because one is frozen. One cannot move anywhere else. Art is about relationships. Yet those who present portraits don't have that luxury. Even when few other objects are thrown on the picture or into the picture or into the painting, those objects stand not in a relationship with the portrait itself. So Andrić is putting in Goya's mouth this idea that somehow there is a specific level of burden that one carries. And we'll see that that burden is something that Andrić constantly struggles with. He's constantly struggling about the tensions and how to represent himself and how to be representative of. Right? Artist gazes upon eternal. This is one of the places that, especially since 1990s, I constantly come back to. Fascination of his with myths, with legends. In fact, in The Bridge on the Drina, he's focusing exclusively on myths and the legends. Many people admire his book because of that. On one hand, he's saying there is nothing in everyday life that is worth remembering. On the other hand, he's not naive. He's saying everything that we know from the everyday life. He's making these kinds of constant come back and forths between the two notions, between the centripetal and centrifugal forces, right? I want to be part of this everyday life, yet there is nothing I can learn about it almost. If we're to know the wisdom, we need to focus on the eternal. By the way, this is one of probably most famous pictures or paintings of Goya in terms of the giant who is observing the world. So I imagined it to be an artist who is gazing upon the eternity and what the eternity is. We'll see that for Andrić, the closest that comes to eternity is a bridge. And bridge embodies the potential wisdom in this connection between this world and the transitions. Art is an activity. I mentioned this, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. He sees art as intrinsically connected to large structural forces of society, to our personal and collective fears that need to be said or explained somewhere, to the potentiality of anti-fears. In other words, confronting who we are and being our best selves, and to the profane things such as geometrical figures that are very important in how we aesthetically see the life, or us as kids playing marbles as we are about to go to school. So he sees art as encompassing, yet his almost a contradiction in his perceptions of art, from gazing upon the eternal, and one can learn only from myths and legends something that actually is a force of a society, to one constantly needs to look down at strawberries, as he likes to say, because that's where the real love grows. Artists and art. So if we were to put the two together and everything that we've talked about so far, there's this notion of constant tension, never-ending tension, where artists presents their art, and art frames the artist, and artist struggles. Artist tries to rescue both what is beautiful and what must be rescued in a social sense of that word. And everything and anything that happens with contingencies. In fact, that is one of the central points of Andrić's meditation about art, that activity and action make only sense if it is directed toward unknown. On that level, clearly one can see him being influenced by Søren Kierkegaard and his leap of faith. Kierkegaard as an existentialist leap of faith as the absolute, ultimate element. Kierkegaard uses it for religious reasons. Andrić uses it in this case in terms of saying that one has to leap into something which is completely unknown. And that is the primary role of the art as a human condition, he calls it, as well as an artist, as an agent within the world in which we live. Okay. Bridges, the second one. What I'd like to do here is show you a bunch of bridges. And while I'm doing that, I'll try to read one, in my opinion, of the most beautiful small reflection about why he loved bridges so much. And hopefully, going back to my subtitle in parentheses, can we build a better world type of a notion, at least the way I understand it. So give me just a second, and then as I read, I would ask you, if you don't mind, to both maybe focus on the reading as well as the pictures or the slides that will be presented for you. Here we go. Of all that a man is impelled to build in this life, nothing is in my eyes finer and more precious than a bridge. Bridges are more important than houses, holier than places of worship, belonging to everyone and at the same time to everyone, useful, built always rationally, in a place in which a greater number of human needs coincide. There are more enduring of human needs that coincide. They are more enduring than other buildings and serve nothing which is sacred or evil. Great stone bridges, witness of vanished ages when people lived, thought, and built differently. Gray or stained with the wind and rain, their sharply chiseled lines worn down with thin grass growing or birds nesting in their joints and imperceptible cracks. Slender iron bridges stretched from one shore to the other like a wire, shaking and resounding with every train that hurtles over them. They seem still to be waiting for their final form and perfection, and the beauty of their lines will be fully disclosed only to the eyes of our grandchildren. Wooden bridges on the way into the little towns of Bosnia, whose furrowed planks sink and creak under the hooves of the village horses. And finally, those tiny bridges in the mountains, nothing but the largest tree trunk of 2 logs riveted together, thrown across the wild stream that would be impossible without them. Twice a year, a flood, the torrent, swept them away, but the peasants, blindly persistent as ants, cut, plane, and built another. That is why one often sees beside those mountain streams, in eddies between rocks, the remain of bridges. They lie and rot like the other wood, washed up their chance. But those worked logs, destined to rot and burn, stand out from the rest of the driftwood and remain one always of the purpose they once served. They are all in essence the same and equally worthy to our attention, for they point out place where a man came across an obstacle and did not turn away, but overcame it, bridged it as best as he could, according to his way of thinking, taste, and circumstances around him. And when I think of bridges, it is not the ones I have crossed most frequently that come to my mind, but those which most held my attention and enthralled me. Above all, the bridges of Sarajevo. On the Miljacka, whose bed is the spine of Sarajevo, they all like stone vertebrae. I see them clearly and count them all. I know their arches. I remember their parapets. Among them are so many that are so beautiful. Then there are bridges I saw on my travels by night from trains, overgrown with ivy and lost in contemplation of their own image in dark water. Wooden bridges in Switzerland, roofed against heavy snowflakes. They look like long barns and are decorated inside with paintings of saints, of miraculous events like chapels. Fantastic bridges in Turkey, flung up roughly, preserved and protected by fate. Roman bridges in southern Italy, made of white stone, from which time has erased all that could be erased, and beside which a new bridge has been in use for 100 years, but which still stands like skeletons or guards. So everywhere in the world, wherever my thoughts wander or pause, they come upon fateful silent bridges as the eternal and eternally unsatisfied human desire to link, to reconcile, and join all that springs up before our spirits and our eyes, so that there should be no division, no confrontation, and no parting. It is the same in my dreams and in my shifting imagination. Listening to the bitterest, most beautiful music I have ever heard, I suddenly saw a stone bridge severed, the broken halves stretching painfully toward each other, demonstrating with one last effort the only possible line of the arch that had disappeared. That is the faithfulness, the irreconcilability of beauty, which permeates only single possibility besides itself, non-existence. In the end, everything through which this life of ours is expressed, thoughts, efforts, glances, smiles, words, sights, is all reaching out to another shore, as toward its aim, and only there will it be granted its true meaning. Everywhere there is something to overcome or to bridge, disorder, death, meaningless. Everything is in transition. A bridge whose ends are lost in infinity, beside which all the bridges of this earth are only children's toys, pale symbols. And all of our hope lies on the other side. You're seeing Ivo Andrić here, standing in front of his memorized bridge on Drina. I can only imagine how he would have felt had he lived through the war in the 90s and see what has happened with his beloved bridge that he really showed to the world, and what kind of crimes and genocide, frankly, took place in the name of the nationalism against which, I would argue, he fought his entire life. Science, the last part. They're meditations. Some of them are more profound than others. With some of them, I had conversations with my own kids. and disagreed with them, particularly with my daughter. I'll get to that one and show you that picture. Here's one. Andrić existentialist. Preserve us, Lord, from the realization of our dreams. Remove us from the object of our desires, for our body desires its own death. There was this tendency of Andrić to really existentialize his writing over and over and over again. Here's yet another one. You should not be afraid of human beings. I'm not. Only of what is inhuman in them. Again, this tension that Andrić constantly brings, particularly of his native Bosnia, is absolutely astounding on many levels in terms of both similarities and differences, love and potential hate. Here's the one that critiques intellectuals that is one of my personal favorites. As I lived among intellectuals, I have been able to see that every individual really does represent a world in himself, or at least a state in himself. This means roughly that everyone has his own inner laws in the world. Everyone has his conception of the world and life, his art and science or religion. And not only that, everyone also has his own internal and foreign policy, his army and armaments and economy, his own seas and deserts. They create all this in complete autocracy and isolation. The first part of their lives, I love this part, the first part of their lives is spent on this activity, while the second, they try to find a way back into the world of the other, ordinary people from whom they have so successfully separated themselves. This tension within each and every of us, what is the better audience than this audience at college, of trying to achieve something that is slightly different, that puts some lights, and yet this deep, deep need to come back to what is everyday and ordinary and to speak that language. Here's another really interesting one, I think. And speaking of the law school and law experience, I very deeply reread this one quite often before I was deciding whether to pursue a career as a lawyer or to move into the academia. When a person who is preordained for a life of thought and is already oriented towards it, when he crosses over the opposite camp, he calls it opposite camp, into the world of exclusively external and material things, it is an enormous disturbance to the world of the spirit, like that of great geological cataclysm for the earth. It is a great loss to both worlds and the ruin of the man himself. But the worst that awaits him in this new life, in which every hour is quite separate hell, is this: such a man brings into the material world all the standards and logic of the spiritual world and order. It is not hard to imagine hellish disharmony of such a life. The man hovers and perishes in torment, as though between two gigantic milestones, between that which he is no longer and that which he cannot and should not become. Right? So there's this constant struggle that he brings on that level. This is the one that I had, and I'll show you. Here it is. Okay. I don't know how to. Okay. When I shared this quote with my daughter, she started yelling at me. His idea is, let us be merciless towards our mistakes and failings, full of understanding of those of others, and tireless in rooting out both. He was a firm believer of life without excuse for an individual, but life full of grace and empathy for everyone else, and desire to root them both out. The small picture, we're in Herceg Novi, Montenegro. In his house, he had tuberculosis as a young man, and after he won a Nobel Prize for Literature, the municipality of Herceg Novi, it's a beautiful place overseeing the bay of the Adriatic, gave him a small piece of land. And he built a house there. And we're visiting his house there. My son and my daughter and my wife is taking a picture. And I'm translating Cyrillics for them, the speech that he gave as he was getting the Nobel Prize for Literature. And then we come to this quote, and she says, "What about self-love? My daughter does." And we start arguing, and I see the generational differences in terms of this being too radical, too stoic, too brutal almost, to think of one's own mistakes as unforgivable, right? I'm much younger, of course, than he is, but I grew up in this kind of a mental framework to think alike on that level. And we didn't come to a conclusion, so to say. The last one, and then we need to go, I know, that I want to finish this first, this one. Three of them are talking. "What is a kiss?" the first person asked. "A new life, an abyss." The two others answered at the same time, right? This whole notion of a very lyrical Andrić. And I'm going to leave you with this. I think it's quite fitting. Every public library is a treasure of our unity. You interpret it as you may. Thank you so much. It was such an honor and pleasure to speak before you.
Thank you, Uros. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We may have time for one question, and that would be about it. Some of us have to get till 1 o'clock.
I know. I'm horrible with timekeeping, so I'm sorry. Sorry, I'll move here in my box.
I have a question.
Please, Maureen.
What was his preferred language for writing, and how does it affect reading translation into English?
Oh my goodness, that's a wonderful question. If I were to guess, he would call it Serbo-Croatian. He was absolutely interesting on that level. He dedicated all of his money from Nobel Prize. I said he built a house, and everything else he gave to the libraries of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the entire amount. He maybe took $20,000, $30,000, and everything else he gave to. So Bosnia is deeply in his work. He was born a Croat. He declared himself a Serb and wrote in so-called Ekavica accent that is typical for Serbian. So he himself represented this notion of what they used to call at that time brotherhood and unity, right? So that's a great question, and it's translated. Fundamentally, people from the former Yugoslavia can understand his language. Thank you for a great question. I really appreciate it.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you again.